Bitches know the hour. Bitches know the hour. Bitches know the hour. Time for yes.
What's up, comrades? Sorry about the lack of videos. As I said in that recent community tab post, I'm going to be really trying to get back into it, and I have been working on some things in the meantime. I also want to give another big shout out to the patrons. I really appreciate the support. With that, let's get to the topic, or topics, at hand. I figured I'd say a little bit about the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO. I guess it could be seen as a little late, but I don't think that matters too much. It's actually kind of a multifaceted topic. I'm sure just about all of you have heard about it by now. It was everywhere. And the promising, but also maybe not so promising, response from a lot of the US public. Or to phrase it more accurately, it may not be as promising as some people think. We'll get into why I put it that way, and other issues, in a moment. First, my reaction. Obviously, I don't care much for capitalists, especially big capitalists, and healthcare capitalists can be even worse, for obvious reasons. It also seems like United Healthcare may be particularly bad in some regards. When I first learned of it, I laughed. I found out about it through S4A's post that mentioned the words written on the shell casings, and I legitimately laughed out loud. The response to the CEO's death actually appears to be overwhelmingly positive, of course, at least from everything I've seen and heard, and compared to what we would have expected prior. I was definitely glad about this, but I think some people are unfortunately significantly overestimating what it means. I've seen some state, or ask, that it's an indication of increased class consciousness. This is almost certainly part of it. I do think class consciousness has increased somewhat in recent times, but for many, it may only be a small germ of class consciousness, or not class consciousness at all. For example, I even saw, a screenshot of, a comment from someone saying that they live in a very conservative area, and many of their coworkers who voted for Trump responded positively to the event. They said something like, "It's not just the left." Could that be a good thing, or a good sign? Potentially, but likely in a very limited way. Maggots are supporters of a big capitalist, and an ultra-reactionary one at that. That doesn't sound like class consciousness. Maybe just baser proletarian instincts showing through, and selective ones at that. That also brings me to something Bad Empanada pointed out, the hypocrisy. Some of the people who are happy about this incident are the same ones that condemn the Palestinian resistance for fighting back against their oppressor, when they're facing a blatant genocide, when their people are being harmed and killed much more directly than the Americans affected by United Healthcare's actions. They care about the former because it affects Americans, but not the latter because it doesn't. In fact, they, again, denounce the Palestinian resistance. Something else that warrants a mention is the fact that we Marxist-Leninists, of course, generally don't support or embrace things like individual acts of violence or assassinations, terrorism, etc., violence that is disconnected from the masses. It typically does nothing to change the system and can have negative effects on the movement. And unfortunately this, the former at least, not doing anything to change the system, will almost certainly be the case for this instance too, obviously. That being said, that doesn't mean we have to straight up condemn any and all acts like this one. And I don't condemn this one. Not at all. For YouTube purposes, I don't condone it, blah 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 blah. I also want to echo something S4A said recently. Don't be a wet blanket about it to people. I was surprised that even some who consider themselves Marxists were doing this, just announcing it and calling it adventurism. Was it adventurism? Yes. But that doesn't mean you should be a downer to a non-Marxist or new leftist or whatever for their positive reaction to the incident. That reaction is a good thing. We can acknowledge it as adventurism amongst ourselves and potentially even explain what that means in a tactful way, but don't be a wet blanket. That said, speaking of it not changing the system, I remember seeing a clip of some mayor responding to the shooting, talking about how this isn't how we solve policy disputes or problems, or whatever. Yeah, okay. It's not going to directly solve the problem, but how do we? We certainly can't get anything done within the bounds of the system, or its laws, which is obviously what he was implying. The system needs to be overthrown. Or, at the very least, for this specific issue, there needs to be huge mass organizing to force the hands of the state and ruling class, though we'd still likely need to do the former even just for the healthcare problem. Also note that these people don't appear to acknowledge all the physical harm people like that CEO and their companies cause. I don't condone murder. Okay, do you condemn what the CEO and his company did to countless people? Effectively killing, or at minimum harming, so many in the name of profit? Because that doesn't even seem to get a mention from you people. Gee, I wonder why. Also, as my sister quite correctly pointed out, really? That's not how, quote, we tackle problems? That's rich coming from a politician in a government known for its violence, destruction, and aggression across the globe. While this act will not change the system, could it potentially embolden the left? Possibly, and that'd be great, but there's also a good chance that it won't. It could also bring the state and ruling class down harder on ordinary people, but maybe not. On the other hand, I have heard that supposedly at least one company decided not to implement a certain unpopular policy that they were going to beforehand in response to this shooting. Speaking of not getting our hopes up too high about levels of class consciousness, the shooter himself, Luigi Mangione, or alleged shooter, I guess, appears to not really grasp the situation. I've heard that, apparently, he talked about CEOs or companies just going too far, that kind of thing, instead of realizing that the system itself is the problem. I also heard that in his manifesto, he was apologizing to the cops and law enforcement, talking about his respect for them, etc. As others have pointed out, we can't just take the authenticity of the supposed manifesto for granted, but it's important to know. And also, as others have said, his being a rightist doesn't necessarily change the situation too much, at least if he is. And honestly, he could very well be, especially if those statements are true. To conclude, I will say this is indeed a positive development. Not even necessarily the event itself, but what it reveals about the US proletariat. Instead of universal condemnation, we've seen quite the opposite from broad sections of the population. And that is definitely good to see. It's just necessary to, as always, try not to overestimate what it means. Let me know if the audio is okay with this one. It's more of a quick and dirty type video, at least in comparison to the usual ones up to this point. Thanks for listening.